Welcome, and prepare yourself for a journey into one of the most unsettling mysteries in American history. Today, we'll travel back more than a century and a half to the sun-baked deserts of California, a place where the whispering wind through the canyons carries echoes of things long buried and best forgotten. As you watch, let us know where you're joining from, because this story, rooted in tragedy and the unknown, will touch every listener in a different way. The year was 1871. The United States was still trying to stitch itself together after the deep wounds of the Civil War. While cities in the East were rebuilding brick by brick, the American West remained wild and unpredictable, a realm of dreams, danger, and desolation. Amid this harsh landscape stood the Alabama hills, a maze of sandstone and granite formations nestled at the foot of California's Sierra Nevada range. These rocks, rising from the desert like twisted hands reaching toward the heavens, would soon become the silent witnesses to a series of events that no one has ever been able to fully explain. The Alabama hills weren't truly a town, more a collection of makeshift camps and miners' outposts scattered among the boulders. The name itself came from Confederate sympathizers who once mined there during the Civil War, naming the region after the CSS Alabama. When the sun dipped behind the mountains, the golden and rust-colored stones cast haunting shadows that stretched for miles across the sand. This was Inyo County, vast, remote, and nearly lawless. Back then, a cry for help could take days, sometimes weeks, to reach the nearest sheriff. Travelers, prospectors, and drifters stopped here seeking fortune or a fresh start beyond society's reach. The hills offered a fragile refuge, a handful of crude buildings, a few taverns made from canvas and timber, and tents pitched under the open sky. Water was precious, the daytime sun merciless, and when night fell, the cold crept into one's bones. People vanished often in such places, swallowed by the land itself, their names carried away on the desert wind. Into this harsh and lonely world came Esther Wade. In the spring of 1871, records from the dusty archives of Inyo County describe her as a 32-year-old woman from Missouri, with dark hair always pinned tightly back and eyes so deep set that those who met her swore they hid something ancient. Traveling alone was rare for a woman in that era, but even stranger was that no one knew what drove her to leave Missouri, or why she had chosen this forsaken stretch of California to begin anew. Her first mention appeared in the Inyo Independent, a small local paper that printed once a week. The brief note reported that a lady from Missouri had arrived near the Alabama hills and taken up residence for trade purposes. But trade in what? What business could a solitary woman possibly conduct among miners and wanderers? The question lingered, unanswered, both then and now. What we know of Esther comes from fragmented testimonies, old letters uncovered decades later, and journals belonging to those who passed through her small settlement. She rented a modest wooden shack that doubled as her home and place of business. Some said she sold food and supplies. Others swore she read fortunes, interpreted dreams, or dabbled in practices darker and less easily spoken of. Whatever her trade, her presence unsettled people. Miners who visited her cabin spoke of a strange heaviness in the air, as if the walls themselves hummed with unseen energy. One traveler, Thomas Garrett, recorded his experience in a diary now preserved by the Inyo Historical Society. In an entry dated May 1871, he confessed that his visit to Esther's place left him deeply disturbed in ways I cannot properly describe. He noted that she rarely spoke, but when she did, her words seemed to linger unnaturally, as though echoing from another realm. As weeks passed, unease grew. A young miner vanished soon after visiting her home, then another, and another. Disappearances weren't uncommon in that perilous land. Men often died in mine collapses, wandered off into the desert, or left without a word. But these cases felt different. Every missing man had last been seen near Esther Wade's dwelling. Suspicion began to spread slowly, like dusk stretching across the plains. Locals avoided her. Merchants refused to sell her goods. Women crossed the street when she passed. Whispers of curses, pacts, and strange lights seen on moonless nights began to circulate. The Alabama hills had always been a place of superstition, but now fear clung to every rock and shadow. In June 1871, a traveling preacher named Reverend Samuel Hutchkins arrived in the area. Troubled by the stories he had heard, he sought Esther out, hoping to offer her spiritual counsel. In his written notes, later discovered among church archives, Hutchkins described her demeanor as cold but strangely composed. He claimed that when he spoke of redemption, she only smiled faintly and replied, "Some doors, once opened, can never again be shut." The remark haunted him for years. He left Alabama Hills the following morning, but continued to reference her in sermons thereafter, calling her the woman from Missouri who bears an invisible burden no soul should carry. His words spread Esther's story far beyond Inyo County, yet to truly understand what happened next, one must remember the mindset of that time. In 1871, superstition ruled hearts and minds. Science had not yet offered answers for the unexplainable. People believed in curses, omens, and unseen forces that wove fate and misfortune together. When something strange occurred, they turned to the supernatural for meaning, seeking answers not in reason, but in fear. Then came the event that shattered what little calm remained. In July 1871, 3 men, Henry Blackwood, James Corian, and William Thorne, departed from the nearby town of Lone Pine, heading north toward the silver mines. To reach their destination, they had to pass through the Alabama Hills, not far from Esther's dwelling. They were well known in the community. Honest, hard-working men with families waiting for them. None of them ever arrived. None of them were ever seen again. 3 days later, when the men failed to appear at the mines, search parties fanned out across the desert. Miners, traders, and local volunteers scoured the trails, ravines, and rocky passes. The desert was a cruel place: snakes, exhaustion, hidden cliffs. But what baffled everyone was how abruptly the trail ended. Their footprints, clear in the dust, stretched in a straight line toward Esther Wade's property, and then simply stopped, about 100 yards from her door. There were no signs of a struggle, no animal tracks, no wagon wheels, no indication of what had happened. It was as though the 3 men had stepped out of existence itself. Those who took part in the search later described an oppressive, almost physical tension in the air as they neared her home. Some grew dizzy or nauseous. Others swore they felt invisible eyes watching them. One miner, Patrick O'Sullivan, recounted that his loyal dog, a fearless companion through years of mining expeditions, refused to move any closer. The animal trembled violently, tail between its legs, growling at something unseen. And at the center of it all stood Esther Wade. Of course, suspicion soon reached the authorities. The Inyo County Sheriff, a man named Benjamin Cross, rode out personally to the Alabama Hills to question Esther Wade. Cross was known throughout the county as a level-headed lawman, a man who rejected superstition and always sought practical answers to the strangest of reports. He believed every mystery had a rational cause, and he was determined to find it. One sweltering afternoon in July 1871, Cross arrived at Esther's small homestead accompanied by 2 deputies. What transpired that day is still preserved in an official report locked away in county records. According to that document, Esther greeted the sheriff with calm composure. She expressed no alarm, no indignation, merely quiet courtesy. When questioned about the disappearance of Henry Blackwood, James Corian, and William Thorne, she insisted she knew nothing of their fate. She admitted that travelers occasionally passed along the nearby trail, but denied having spoken to any recently. Cross asked permission to search the property, and she consented without protest. The deputies combed through every corner of the cabin and surrounding grounds. They found almost nothing of interest. Just a few household items, some dried food, several well-worn books described by Cross as philosophical, mystical, or spiritual in nature, and a collection of small trinkets that appeared harmless. Yet the report contained notes that went beyond facts. The sheriff wrote that the air inside the cabin felt strangely heavy, as though it carried a charge of unseen energy. One of his deputies suddenly became ill during the search, stumbling outside and vomiting violently with no clear cause. Cross observed that Esther never looked away during questioning. Her eyes locked on his the entire time. He wrote, "Her gaze seemed to contain knowledge I could not name, as though she saw more than what lay before us." Although no evidence was found, the sheriff concluded that something in that place felt profoundly wrong. The townsfolk, however, were not reassured. The loss of 3 respected men, all family men known and trusted, sent waves of fear rippling through the county. Wives demanded answers. Neighbors whispered about divine punishment. But how could there be justice without proof? No bodies, no witnesses, no trace beyond footprints that ended in dust. It was then the first rumors of a curse began to take form. No one knows who said the words first, but soon everyone was repeating them. The curse of Esther Wade. People claimed she could draw men to ruin with a glance, that she possessed powers born of forbidden arts learned somewhere far from the light. Others whispered that she had carried something dark out of Missouri, a secret best left buried. The newspapers seized upon the hysteria. The Inyo Independent, which had once mentioned her only briefly, now printed sensational columns about the case. In August 1871, the paper ran a letter from a reader who swore he had seen unnatural lights flickering around the woman's cabin. Late at night, another wrote of hearing eerie sounds echoing through the rocks after sundown, groans that sounded neither human nor beast. Panic spread like wildfire. Businesses shuttered, families packed wagons, and caravans fled the region entirely. The once busy camps of the Alabama hills fell silent. Only a few remained behind, the stubborn, the desperate, or the morbidly curious. Through it all, Esther Wade remained where she was. Witnesses saw her wandering the barren slopes at dawn, moving slowly among the crimson boulders, always alone, always silent. Some claimed she gathered herbs and stones for unknown purposes. Others swore she merely stood motionless for hours, gazing toward the horizon as if waiting for something unseen to arrive. Then, as summer bled into September, 2 more travelers vanished. This time, the missing men were strangers to the area. Adventurers named Marcus Dalton and Theodore Price. They had stopped in the Alabama hills for a night's rest before continuing north, unaware of the local legends. Their names were entered in the logbook of a nearby trading post, the last record of their existence. Days later, their horses were found wandering the desert, but of the men, there was nothing. Sheriff Cross returned once again, this time more grim and desperate than before. He camped near Esther's property for 3 nights, determined to observe everything personally. His private notes, discovered by historians decades later, reveal a man unmoored by fear. He confessed to suffering strange, vivid dreams during those nights, endless black corridors, murmuring voices in unfamiliar tongues, and a sensation of falling into darkness without end. Despite his unease, Cross found no crime he could prove, no blood, no graves, no confession. Esther Wade remained poised, calm, and entirely beyond his understanding. Defeated, the sheriff rode back to Lone Pine, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a growing dread that reason alone could no longer explain. By October, the situation had reached a breaking point. The scattered inhabitants of the Alabama hills and surrounding lands began whispering about taking matters into their own hands. Groups of armed men gathered in what few taverns remained, voices low but full of anger. The law had failed, perhaps they said. Justice must come another way. The air itself seemed charged with violence waiting to happen. Autumn descended over the desert, and with it came a chilling wind from the Sierra Nevada peaks. The nights grew colder, the sky turning a bruised gray above the rugged hills. The land, already desolate, now felt mournful, as if holding its breath for what was to come. It was then that a new figure entered the story: Augustus Freeman, a traveling merchant from Sacramento. Freeman made his living selling tools, fabric, and household goods to remote frontier settlements. He had never heard of Esther Wade or the tales surrounding her. To him, the Alabama hills were just another stop on a long trade route through California's wilderness. That ignorance would prove fatal. Freeman pitched his tent about half a kilometer from Esther's cabin and opened his modest stall to the remaining residents. For the first few days, everything seemed ordinary enough. Locals came by to buy goods, exchange gossip, and share news from the outside world. Not one of them dared to mention Esther Wade or the disappearances. On the 3rd evening, as dusk blurred into violet shadows, Freeman noted in his ledger that he had received a visitor. A woman of refined bearing, plainly dressed, with eyes that seemed to look straight through me. She lingered over bolts of fabric in silence, her hands gliding over the cloth with deliberate, almost ritual grace. Freeman, ever the polite salesman, attempted conversation, but she answered only with single words, her voice low and distant. When she left, she purchased nothing and vanished into the gathering darkness. It was only the following morning that Freeman learned from a miner who his late night customer had been. When told it was Esther Wade, he laughed, dismissing the man's warnings as local superstition born from isolation and fear. But there was something in the miner's expression, a raw sincerity in his trembling voice, that unsettled the merchant. A seed of unease took root in his mind, one that would soon grow into terror. That same night, Augustus Freeman was roused from sleep by strange and unsettling noises. In his later notes, he described the sounds as distant, overlapping chants, many voices weaving together in eerie harmonies that didn't belong to any music known to him. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the rock formations in a way that made it impossible to determine its true source. Alarmed and curious, Freeman grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside his tent to investigate. What he witnessed would remain seared into his memory for the rest of his life. Off in the distance, near the remains of Esther Wade's house, a light flickered with a strange, irregular rhythm. It wasn't the familiar glow of a lamp or the soft blaze of a campfire. It was something unnatural, a faint greenish light that appeared to seep up from the earth itself. Around that pulsating glow, Freeman swore he saw dark, formless figures moving, shadows without clear shapes, their outlines shifting constantly like smoke stirred by invisible hands. He stood frozen, trapped between fascination and terror, unable to look away from the impossible spectacle before him. He could not tell how long he remained there, minutes or perhaps hours, before the paralysis lifted and his body finally obeyed him. In blind panic, Freeman stumbled back into his tent, fastened the entrance with trembling hands, and huddled beneath his blankets, whispering the old prayers his mother had taught him when he was a child. He did not sleep again that night. At the first sign of dawn, Freeman packed his belongings in a desperate rush. He didn't bother to arrange his wares properly. Bolts of fabric, tools, and boxes were thrown haphazardly into the wagon. Some heavier items were left behind altogether, as speed mattered far more than the safety of his inventory. By midday he had fled the Alabama hills, his wagon rattling violently along the uneven trails as he urged his horses onward with all the force he could muster. Word of his experience spread quickly. Freeman stopped briefly in Lone Pine to tell his story to anyone willing to listen, then continued his journey, never to return. The tale soon found its way into the local paper and was later reprinted across California. Each retelling embellished the account further. Some additions born of imagination, others from alleged witnesses claiming to have seen or heard similar unexplained phenomena in the area. Soon the idea of a curse took root in the public's mind. Letters flooded Sheriff Cross's office from all over the state, some offering help, others begging for more information about the mysterious events that had seized public fascination. A team of self-proclaimed investigators from San Francisco even announced their intention to uncover the truth behind the Alabama Hills mystery. They never arrived. Contemporary reports suggest they abandoned their expedition after receiving cryptic anonymous warnings, though no official explanation was ever recorded. Meanwhile, Esther Wade herself all but vanished from public sight. Few claimed to have seen her after those events. Supplies left near her property were paid for with small leather pouches of gold coins that appeared overnight. No one ever saw her collect the provisions, nor deliver the payments. Everything about her existence seemed confined to darkness, as though she had become a creature of the night. In November, a new figure entered the story, a man whose arrival would change everything. His name was Elias Blackthorne, a self-proclaimed scholar of unexplained phenomena. He hailed from Boston and claimed years of experience studying strange disappearances and supernatural disturbances. Tall and lean, with a precisely trimmed grey beard and eyes of piercing intensity, he cut a figure both commanding and unsettling. He always wore black and carried a worn leather case filled with unusual devices no one in the region could identify. Unlike everyone else, Blackthorne showed no trace of fear. While residents shunned the Alabama hills as though cursed, he deliberately established his camp within sight of Esther Wade's property. His intentions were made clear from the start: to investigate the vanishings, document any strange occurrences, and, if possible, confront the source of whatever haunted that land. For days, he worked tirelessly among the rocks, taking readings with odd instruments, compasses that spun without reason, thermometers that registered abrupt drops in temperature, and homemade contraptions whose function no one could discern. He filled entire notebooks with precise observations, sketched detailed maps of the terrain, and marked locations where he claimed natural law seemed to fail. People from nearby towns watched from afar, torn between admiration and dread. Some believed he was a madman. Others saw him as humanity's last hope of understanding the horror that had gripped the hills. Sheriff Cross personally met with Blackthorne, offering his cooperation and granting access to all official records of the disappearances. The researcher spent a full night poring over those reports before finally declaring himself ready for the most crucial step of his work: direct contact with Esther Wade herself. He sent her a formal letter requesting an audience, politely asking to visit and speak about the events. No one expected a reply. Yet 3 days later, a message appeared at the entrance of his camp, written in graceful script, inviting him to dine at her home the following evening. The date was November 23, 1871. Word of this meeting spread rapidly, stirring both morbid curiosity and genuine terror. Those who still lingered near the Alabama hills tried desperately to dissuade him, warning that anyone who approached Esther Wade never returned. Blackthorne listened courteously, but remained resolute. He had crossed an entire continent to reach this place. Retreat was not an option. On the morning of the appointed day, he made careful preparations. He organized his research materials, labeled each sample, and wrote a detailed summary of his findings. This document he entrusted to Sheriff Cross, instructing him to forward it to a research institute in Boston and to several major newspapers should he fail to return by dawn. Blackthorne knew the risk and accepted it without hesitation. As twilight descended over the Alabama hills, the researcher approached Esther Wade's home. The dying sun painted the mountains in crimson and violet, while the rocks stretched long, warped shadows across the earth, transforming the landscape into something dreamlike and menacing. Carrying only his notebook and instrument case, Blackthorne knocked on the weathered door 3 times. Esther Wade answered in person. For the first time, she was described in vivid detail, a woman who appeared both youthful and ancient at once, her grey eyes reflecting the dying light with an uncanny depth. Her dark attire was simple, her hair tied back neatly, and her soft voice carried a gravity that words could barely convey. The interior of her home was sparse and unadorned. A small wooden table stood at its center, already set for 2, with a pair of lit candles flickering beside plain dishes. The walls were bare except for a modest shelf of books, whose titles Blackthorne quietly tried to memorize. The silence was heavy, almost unnatural, as though the very air refused to carry sound. Dinner, as he later noted, was simple but deliberate, and it marked the beginning of what would become the most terrifying chapter in the Alabama Hills legend. Dinner was simple yet deliberate. Staples of bread, cheese, pickled vegetables, and freshly drawn well water. Esther served each item with slow, deliberate precision, her movements so controlled that they almost seemed ritualistic. For several minutes, the two of them ate in silence. The only sounds were the faint crackling of candle wicks and the subtle scrape of utensils on earthenware plates. Blackthorne, ever the observer, watched closely, noting each gesture, each flicker of the candlelight, each subtle anomaly in the air. The flames danced as if disturbed by a non-existent breeze. It was Esther who finally broke the silence. She inquired about his long journey from Boston, speaking with unexpected familiarity about his academic work and even referencing specific investigations he had conducted in other parts of the country. Blackthorne was taken aback. None of this information had been published outside of restricted scholarly circles that someone living in isolation within the Alabama hills could not possibly access. Puzzled, he asked how she had come to know these details. Esther only smiled, a faint, knowing expression that offered no comfort. She replied that there were many ways to acquire knowledge, means that didn't rely on letters, books, or spoken word. Blackthorne pressed for an explanation, demanding something tangible, but what followed took the conversation in a direction he could never have foreseen. Esther began to speak of perception beyond the 5 accepted senses, of unseen threads linking all living things, of dimensions layered upon reality that humanity rarely, if ever, perceives consciously. The researcher's mind raced. He jotted notes furiously, filling page after page in his notebook, his handwriting increasingly frantic as he tried to impose scientific order on her cryptic ideas. He questioned, categorized, and attempted to translate her claims into the language of physics and psychology, but the more she spoke, the more her words slipped beyond reason's reach. She was not speaking of religion nor of spirits or devils. Her tone was philosophical, almost mathematical, describing a vision of existence more intricate, more alien, than any theological or scientific model could contain. When Blackthorn finally dared to ask her directly about the disappearances, Esther fell utterly silent. The air in the room changed. The candles flickered wildly, though no wind stirred. The temperature dropped until Blackthorn could see his own breath. When Esther finally looked at him, her grey eyes reflected the candlelight in a way that seemed not quite human. Her voice, when she spoke again, was low and steady. "Some thresholds once crossed," she said, "change those who cross them forever." Blackthorn didn't fully understand. He pressed her again for concrete answers. Esther denied any personal role in the vanishings, but admitted that the Alabama hills were different. A place where the boundaries, separating one plane of existence from another, were thinner, weaker. Those who went missing, she suggested, might have stumbled into regions where no return was possible. The researcher protested, insisting that such ideas contradicted every known law of nature. Esther only smiled faintly and said that those laws were merely fragments, glimpses of a greater design humanity had yet to comprehend. She spoke of civilizations long vanished that once possessed forbidden knowledge, insight into the structure of reality itself. Knowledge deliberately buried or erased over millennia. The hours slipped away unnoticed as she continued to speak. Blackthorn's hand ached from writing, yet he could not stop. Esther spoke of her own search for knowledge, of the sacrifices demanded by understanding truths most people would not dare imagine. Her voice was calm, almost tender, yet every sentence carried the quiet weight of something vast and terrible. At some indeterminate hour, both candles extinguished at once. The darkness that followed was absolute, not the simple absence of light, but a void so complete it felt alive. Blackthorn's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Before he could rise, the flames reappeared on their own, steady and silent. Esther had not moved. She sat motionless, her gaze fixed upon him with an expression impossible to read. Then he glanced toward the window and froze. The sky outside was no longer the familiar night. It was an endless, devouring black. No stars, no moon, not even the faintest glow of horizon or cloud. It was as if the universe itself had been erased. "What is happening?" he asked, his voice breaking. "You are seeing past the veil," Esther answered softly. "Just a glimpse of what lies behind the illusions you call reality." The terror that filled him was unlike any fear of harm or death. It was a deeper horror, the realization that the world itself might not be what it seemed. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. When he opened them again, the stars had returned, and the crescent moon once more illuminated the pale contours of the Alabama hills. Esther rose, her tone now gentle. She told him it was late, and that he should return to his camp before dawn. Drained in body and spirit, Blackthorn packed his notebook, thanked her for the meal, and made for the door. Before he could step outside, she lightly touched his arm. "Leave this place," she whispered. "There are forces here beyond your understanding, things that should remain unobserved." The words lingered in his mind long after he stepped into the cold November air. The path back to camp should have taken no more than 15 minutes, yet that night it felt endless. The familiar rock formations now seemed alien, their shadows stretching unnaturally across the pale ground. Shapes shifted at the corners of his vision, and the silence pressed so heavily that he could hear the thundering of his own heartbeat. When he finally reached his tent, he lit every lamp he owned, flooding the space with light. It was not comfort, but a desperate attempt to anchor himself in reality. He sat down and opened his notebook, reviewing the words he had written during that strange dinner. Line after line seemed incoherent, his hurried script struggling to capture ideas that dissolved as soon as he reread them. The more he tried to make sense of his notes, the less they resembled anything rational, yet the unease they stirred grew deeper. Blackthorn did not sleep that night. He spent the dark hours compiling a report of everything that had transpired, trying to shape his experience into a framework others could grasp. But how could he describe the vanishing of the stars? How could he explain the overwhelming sense that he had glimpsed overlapping realities, each pressing faintly against the other? By dawn, he had reached his decision. He would take Esther's advice and leave the Alabama hills immediately. His departure, he wrote in his final note, was not an act of fear but of humility. There were mysteries in that barren land that existed far beyond the limits of human understanding, and he had already seen more than enough. There were truths buried in that desert that no device or calculation could ever uncover. Perhaps some mysteries were simply never meant to be solved, at least not within the narrow limits of human reason in that era. Accepting this, Elias Blackthorne began to dismantle his instruments and prepare for departure. That was when he realized something was wrong. Several of his tools had gone dead. Compasses that once spun erratically now stood frozen, their needles fixed on a direction that made no sense. Neither north nor any known bearing, but somewhere beyond comprehension. Thermometers showed absurd readings, veering between searing heat and impossible cold. The delicate instruments of his own design refused to react at all, as if smothered by some unseen interference. Blackthorne wasted no time investigating. Instinct told him it was best to leave. He packed his equipment swiftly, loaded the wagon, and began to harness the horses. The animals were anxious, their eyes wide, ears twitching as though they sensed something their master could not perceive. He murmured softly to them, calming their panic until they finally obeyed. Before mounting, he turned once more toward Esther Wade's home. The house stood utterly still. No smoke rose from the chimney, no movement stirred the windows. It looked deserted. Though Blackthorne knew she was there, perhaps hidden behind those dark panes, watching silently as he departed. He set out while the sun still hung low over the eastern ridges. The journey toward Lone Pine was strangely tranquil. It felt as if he had stepped once more into a world governed by order and reason, a place where natural law reigned without distortion. When he reached the town, Blackthorne stopped only long enough to deliver a sealed packet to Sheriff Cross, his field notes, and a brief letter confirming that he was leaving the region. Cross read the report carefully, his expression hardening as he turned the pages. The document was precise, methodical, and deeply troubling. It contained no direct accusations, yet the implications were unlike anything within the reach of conventional law. How could a sheriff pursue a crime that might not exist within the world of flesh and blood? How could justice confront a threat that had no form? Uncertain what else to do, Cross filed the papers among his personal archives, marking them unsolved. He suspected they would remain that way forever. Blackthorne continued eastward. In time, he returned to Boston, attempting to resume his old routines, lectures, research, correspondence. But he was not the same man. Colleagues noticed a change in him, a subtle withdrawal, an erosion of confidence, a haunted distance in his eyes. He eventually published a modest academic paper on unexplained phenomena of the Western Territories, but he omitted the details of what had happened in the Alabama hills. Critics dismissed the work as speculative nonsense, and it soon faded from scholarly memory. Meanwhile, the desert did not forget. Winter descended upon the Alabama hills. In December of 1871, the first snow of the season dusted the red and Utcher rock formations in a thin white veil. The sharp contrast between stone and frost lent the landscape an eerie beauty, and an even deeper loneliness. The cold forced out the few remaining families who had stubbornly stayed through the months of fear. By year's end, Alabama Hills was almost entirely deserted. Only Esther Wade remained, unseen but ever present, and the occasional wanderer who passed too close to her property. The vanishings did not cease. In January of 1872, 3 more people disappeared. February brought 2 additional names to the growing list. Families from faraway towns eventually noticed their absence and contacted Sheriff Cross, but his investigations led nowhere. No witnesses, no traces, no answers, only the same silence that had settled over those barren hills. The story, however, continued to live in print. The California press and countless regional newspapers could not resist the allure of the mystery. It was the perfect tale, an isolated woman, strange phenomena, and the yawning emptiness of the frontier. Some editors attempted to frame it rationally, suggesting that Esther led a hidden gang of thieves who preyed upon travelers and concealed their victims in remote canyons. Others abandoned logic entirely, filling their pages with lurid stories of witchcraft, infernal bargains, and ancient curses buried in the Californian sands. Public fascination grew. By March, curiosity turned to fanaticism. A group of devout men from Sacramento decided that God himself demanded intervention. Led by a preacher named Josiah Petton, a fierce fundamentalist known for his uncompromising sermons about good and evil, they declared it their sacred mission to cleanse the Alabama hills of its curse. Petton gathered 6 followers, men of unwavering conviction, and together they journeyed south through the thawing countryside. They arrived in mid-March, when the last snows were melting from the rocks. Their camp stood within sight of Esther's home, though none dared venture too close. Peyton announced to the sparse locals that he would drive out the darkness that had taken root there. He and his followers spent 3 full days fasting, praying, and preparing themselves for what they believed would be a confrontation with something unholy. On the 4th morning, the men advanced toward Esther Wade's house in solemn formation. They carried Bibles pressed to their chests, crucifixes raised high, and bottles of consecrated water from their church in Sacramento. Peyton pounded on the door, his booming voice commanding Esther to appear and face divine judgment. There was no answer. He struck the door again louder until the echoes of his fury faded into the still air. Finally, declaring that no servant of evil would be allowed sanctuary, he ordered his men to break down the door. With shouts of scripture, they forced their way inside, only to be met with an emptiness that chilled them to the bone. The house was deserted, not merely vacant but hollow, stripped of all sign of life. No furniture, no utensils, no books or clothing, only bare wooden walls and a thin film of dust that covered the floor like untouched snow. It looked as though no one had set foot there in months. The preacher's confidence faltered. He and his men searched every corner, every board and beam, even probing the ground for hidden doors or concealed cellars. There was nothing, no trace of Esther Wade, no sign of struggle or departure. The building stood exactly as it appeared, a shell empty and echoing. Still, Peyton refused to believe his mission had ended in failure. He ordered his followers to proceed with the cleansing ritual regardless. For hours they prayed, chanted psalms, and splashed holy water upon the walls. They drew crosses on the doorframes and proclaimed the house free of corruption. When the ceremony was complete, Peyton declared that the evil had been banished by faith. Yet even as he spoke, there was hesitation in his voice, a faint quiver of uncertainty his men could feel but dared not acknowledge. They left Alabama Hills before sunset, convinced, or trying to convince themselves, that they had fulfilled their duty. Upon returning to Sacramento, Josiah Peyton publicly proclaimed that the region had been redeemed by the power of God. But those who listened closely to him in the months that followed noticed something in his eyes. A shadow of doubt that faith alone could not erase. Peyton's triumphant return to Sacramento was celebrated as a victory of faith over darkness. From his pulpit, he delivered fiery sermons proclaiming that the Alabama Hills had been liberated from infernal influence, that the cursed woman had fled before the light of their divine conviction. Newspapers across California eagerly printed the accounts. Some hailed him as a hero of righteousness, others printed his claims with thinly veiled doubt, but his version of events soon became the accepted story. For many, desperate to close a chapter filled with fear and confusion, Peyton's testimony provided the sense of resolution they craved, even if it was far from the truth. Reality, however, told a different story, one far stranger than even the preacher could imagine. Esther Wade had not fled, she had simply vanished. There were no witnesses, no travel records, no reports of her boarding any stagecoach or train. Sheriff Cross, diligent as always, followed every possible lead. He wrote to neighboring jurisdictions, checked passenger manifests, and even contacted law enforcement in other states. Nothing surfaced. It was as if Esther Wade had evaporated into thin air, just like the others who had disappeared around her property. Speculation filled the silence. Some believed she had walked into the desert, overcome by guilt or madness, and perished beneath the merciless sun. Search parties combed the hills, but no remains were ever found. Others insisted she had escaped under the cover of night, assuming a new identity somewhere far away. Yet those who had seen her and understood the strange gravity surrounding her doubted such ordinary explanations. There was something about Esther Wade that existed beyond the reach of simple human stories, something that refused to fit within the boundaries of life or death. In the months that followed, the Alabama Hills began to change once more. With Esther gone and Peyton's supposed triumph circulating through the newspapers, people slowly trickled back into the area. Miners reopened abandoned claims. Traders returned to the few surviving shops. A handful of families contemplated rebuilding their deserted homes. Life, as it always does, sought to reclaim what terror had driven away. Yet not everyone believed that the danger had truly passed. Travelers still spoke in hushed tones of peculiar sensations when they crossed certain ridges, of an uneasy pressure in the air, or of whispers heard in the wind at dusk. Some claimed to glimpse shapes flickering among the rocks, vanishing the moment they turned their eyes directly upon them. Most dismissed these tales as superstition, the residue of a community's collective trauma. But there were too many reports to be ignored entirely. Esther Wade's property, however, remained untouched. No one dared purchase it, even when its value dropped to nearly nothing. The house began to decay in the relentless sun, paint blistering, timbers warping, windows shattering one by one. By the mid-1870s it leaned crookedly against the landscape, a hollow skeleton of what had once been a home. Locals avoided it, though travelers occasionally stopped to stare, sensing in its silence the echo of something unresolved. It became an unofficial monument to the unknown. Over time, the Esther Wade affair faded from public memory. Newspapers lost interest, turning their attention to fresher scandals and newer mysteries. The great machine of progress rolled forward, leaving the past half buried beneath layers of forgetfulness. Yet for the families of those who had vanished, forgetting was impossible. Husbands, wives, brothers, and children lived on with the ache of not knowing. There were no graves to visit, no ceremonies of closure, only the unbearable stillness of unanswered questions. Among the grieving was Margaret Corian, whose husband James had disappeared in July 1871. For years she pursued every possible lead, writing letters to officials, hiring private investigators, even consulting mediums and spiritualists who claimed to speak with the dead. None could tell her what had become of him. Eventually, drained of money and strength, she surrendered to the silence, not from disbelief, but from exhaustion. Sheriff Benjamin Cross never reconciled himself with the case either. He kept the files locked in a cabinet in his office, revisiting them from time to time, hoping that some overlooked clue might one day make sense. But as the years rolled on, the answers never came. When he retired in 1883, he handed the position and the burden to his successor, along with the thick folder marked the Esther Wade case. The new sheriff read it once, grew pale, and decided to let the past rest undisturbed. As for Elias Blackthorne, the scholar from Boston who had once dined with Esther on that cold November night, he never again set foot in California. He continued his research into anomalies and natural philosophy, but he avoided any subject remotely resembling what he had witnessed in the Alabama hills. In private letters to trusted colleagues, he would occasionally remark that there existed certain mysteries mankind was not meant to uncover, certain knowledge better left untouched. His peers dismissed these warnings as eccentric musings of a brilliant mind growing old. But those who knew his story understood that his caution was born of experience, not madness. Decades slipped quietly by. The 19th century gave way to the 20th. The Alabama hills, stripped of their sinister reputation, became a curiosity for tourists and, eventually, a beloved filming location for motion pictures. Somewhere in the early 1900s, what remained of Esther Wade's house finally collapsed. Its timbers consumed by time and the desert wind. The ground swallowed its remains, erasing the last visible trace of her existence. Yet legends have a way of surviving even when all evidence fades. In the saloons of Lone Pine, old men would still tell wide-eyed travelers about the strange woman who lived alone in 1871. The witch, the widow, the spirit of the hills, depending on who told the story. Facts blurred with imagination, the truth twisted into folklore. Over time, Esther Wade ceased to be a person and became a myth. A warning whispered across generations about the dangers of curiosity and the places where shadows linger too long. Modern historians studying Inyo County's past occasionally stumble upon the case in dusty archives. Most dismiss it as a combination of hysteria, superstition, and lost records. A few, however, dig deeper. They find fragments, letters, police notes, and contradictory testimonies, enough to sense that something deeper lies hidden beneath the official accounts. According to surviving county documents, at least 17 people vanished between April 1871 and March 1872. 17 names formally recorded, though many researchers suspect the real number was far higher. Countless travelers of that time left no paper trail, no families to report them missing, no expectation of arrival anywhere. How many of them passed through the Alabama hills and never emerged? That question has never been answered. What makes the mystery endure for modern scholars is the pattern, the precision of it. The disappearances were not random, nor the accounts entirely inconsistent. Across the fragments that remain, one thing persists like an echo through the decades, a sense that something in those hills once awakened, and perhaps has never fully gone back to sleep. All of the disappearances shared an unsettling precision. Every missing person vanished within a narrow radius around Esther Wade's homestead, never farther than 2 kilometers in any direction. Every case occurred during the exact period when she was verifiably living in the area, and every unexplained disappearance ceased entirely after she herself vanished. Skeptics have long argued that these connections are nothing more than coincidence, cautioning that drawing conclusions from such patterns is the hallmark of superstition rather than science. Yet even the most pragmatic observers cannot help but feel uneasy at how neatly the details align. Beyond the geography and timing lies another layer of disturbing consistency: the sensory accounts. Witnesses who had no contact with one another, separated by weeks or even months, reported almost identical experiences. They spoke of abrupt temperature drops localized to small patches of ground, of air that grew heavy and pressed down on their lungs, of strange lapses in time where hours seemed to compress into minutes or stretch endlessly. Some described lights that shimmered without visible source. Others heard sounds that seemed to come from beneath the earth or from some immeasurable distance. When numerous unrelated people describe the same sensations with such precision, the argument for mass delusion becomes harder to sustain. Equally haunting are the fates of those who attempted to probe the mystery too closely. Elias Blackthorne may have survived his encounter with Esther Wade, though profoundly changed by it, but others were not as fortunate. In February 1872, a San Francisco journalist named Robert Whitmore arrived in the Alabama hills, determined to expose the truth. He intended to write the ultimate investigative piece that would, at last, explain the vanishing men. But the article was never written. 3 weeks after he set out, his body was discovered roughly 5 miles south of the hills. The coroner ruled the cause of death as exposure, yet the details defied logic. Whitmore had carried sufficient supplies, was known for his expertise in desert survival, and the weather during that period had been mild. Why then had he wandered aimlessly until death claimed him? Another investigator met a different, but equally troubling fate. Daniel Frost, a private detective commissioned by the family of one of the missing men, arrived in April 1872, after Esther's disappearance. For 2 weeks he conducted a systematic inquiry, interviewing locals, sketching maps, and collecting notes. Then, without warning, he closed the case. He sent a terse telegram to his clients stating only that he was terminating the investigation and returning their payment. When contacted many years later by a historian studying the disappearances, Frost refused to speak of it, declaring that the matter was not to be discussed under any circumstance. Such patterns suggest a possibility as chilling as it is intangible, that the investigation itself carried a form of peril, as though those who sought answers too earnestly drew the gaze of something that preferred to remain unseen. Perhaps it was this quiet, instinctive fear that ultimately allowed the case to sink into obscurity, tucked away in dusty archives where forgetting became an act of self-preservation. The enigma of Esther Wade's identity remains as opaque as every other element of her story. The records of Missouri, where she was said to have originated, reveal no woman of her name matching her age, background, or timeline. This absence has led researchers to speculate that Esther Wade may have been an assumed identity, a mask worn for reasons known only to her. Yet even if that were true, one question persists: why choose the Alabama hills, of all the vast spaces in America, to settle under such secrecy? What was it about those specific stones and ridges that called to her? Certain scholars of the occult and comparative mythology have suggested that the Alabama hills held ancient significance long before the arrival of settlers. Both Paiute and Shoshone oral traditions speak of places where the earth thins, places not meant for human habitation after sundown, where spirits crossed freely between worlds. They describe such sites as thresholds, locations of power and peril alike. Directly linking those legends to the events of 1871 is of course speculative, but the resonance is difficult to ignore. What is not speculative is the case's lingering mark on the collective psyche of the region. More than a century and a half later, residents of Lone Pine still speak of the Alabama hills with quiet respect, a mixture of fascination and restraint, Tour guides now tell watered-down versions of the tale to curious visitors, turning genuine tragedy into sanitized folklore. Yet among the old families whose ancestors lived through that time, the full story is seldom repeated. They insist that some memories should not be toyed with, that even the retelling can stir things best left dormant. There have been attempts over the decades to revisit the case officially. In 1947, the Inyo County District Attorney reopened the files as part of a project to document historical cold cases. He studied every surviving record, visited the hills himself, and consulted experts from multiple disciplines. His public conclusion was mundane. The disappearances, he wrote, were the product of misadventure, crime, and exaggerated rumor. Yet his private notebooks, discovered after his death, tell another story. In them, he admitted that several details simply refused to align with any rational explanation he could construct. In the 1970s, a group of parapsychologists from a California university sought to study the area scientifically. They proposed using modern sensors to detect electromagnetic or atmospheric anomalies that might correspond to the historical reports. Local authorities denied the request, citing preservation concerns, but whispers among county staff suggested a deeper motive, a reluctance to invite renewed scrutiny to a story that had finally gone still. The land where Esther Wade's house once stood has changed hands numerous times, but remains undeveloped. Technically, it is private property. In practice, it is abandoned ground. Visitors occasionally leave small stone cans or trinkets at the site, offerings of uncertain intent. Some say they honor the lost travelers, others claim they are meant for Esther herself. Whatever the reason, the tributes are periodically removed by officials, yet they always return, as though compelled by something unseen. Today, the Alabama hills are celebrated for their cinematic beauty. Weathered rock formations beneath enormous skies, shaped by arms of wind and time. Tourists marvel at the scenery, unaware of the stories buried beneath it. But for those who know the full history, the landscape carries an unease that beauty cannot erase. The shadows seem too deep, the silence too absolute, and the rocks themselves appear to hold secrets older than memory. In truth, we will never know exactly what transpired there during those lost months of 1871. The evidence is fragmented, the witnesses long gone, the central figures dissolved into myth. Perhaps that very uncertainty is the essence of the story, a reminder of how fragile our understanding of reality can be. Some events exist in a twilight between the explainable and the unknowable, refusing to yield to logic or faith. The story of Esther Wade belongs to that twilight. It endures not because of answers, but because of the absence of them, because it stirs something ancient within us, the fear of the unknown, of the outsider, of places where ordinary laws no longer apply. In the end, Esther embodied every one of those fears. A solitary woman in a time when solitude was suspect, an enigma whose presence altered the very atmosphere around her. Modern psychologists might interpret the Alabama Hills affair as a case study in collective anxiety, how communities under strain invent monsters to make sense of chaos. There is truth in that explanation, just as there is truth in the lingering unease that still clings to those stones. Between those two truths lies the enduring mystery, one that neither science nor superstition has yet managed to dispel. The year 1871 stood as a time of profound uncertainty and transition in America. Only 6 years had passed since the Civil War's end, yet the nation still bore the raw wounds of that conflict, moral, emotional, and physical. The Western territories remained unstable, their laws pliable and justice often dependent on proximity and power. Remote settlements lived under constant tension, haunted by isolation, scarcity, and the unforgiving rhythms of nature. Within such an environment, it is hardly surprising that people search for clear, simple causes to explain the inexplicable. That interpretation, though psychologically convincing, falls short when confronted with the peculiar precision of the Alabama Hills accounts. It cannot explain why Elias Blackthorne's instruments malfunctioned in ways that defied mechanical logic. It cannot explain the perfect geographic symmetry of the disappearances, or why seasoned investigators, men accustomed to hardship and mystery, suddenly abandoned their work without reason. Reducing the entire episode to communal hysteria or superstition may offer intellectual comfort, but perhaps that comfort is an illusion, a way to avoid the possibility that something far more disturbing was at play. Throughout many philosophical and mystical traditions, there runs a persistent idea That reality is not a single flat surface, but layered, composed of dimensions accessible only through altered states, discipline, or rare natural ability. Some claim that certain individuals can perceive and even manipulate these unseen strata. If such a notion is entertained even hypothetically, Esther Wade might represent one of these rare individuals. Someone who operated according to principles that transcended Newtonian mechanics and ordinary material understanding. The conversations Blackthorne recorded between himself and Esther lend unsettling weight to that theory. She did not speak like a zealot or a delusional visionary. Her speech was measured, technical, almost clinical, the language of someone describing genuine processes that simply lacked a vocabulary within conventional science. Her statements implied an organized system of knowledge, one that brushed the edges of metaphysics without the vagueness of mysticism. This leads to a haunting question. How many others through history have held comparable knowledge, only to vanish from the record, suppressed, discredited, or erased? Esther Wade's life hints at the high price of forbidden understanding. In her discussions with Blackthorne, she warned that enlightenment carried its own consequences, that some thresholds, once crossed, could never be receded from. That caution echoes through humanity's oldest myths. Prometheus, punished for bringing fire to humankind; Eve, cast out for seeking the fruit of knowledge; Faust, condemned for bargaining with powers beyond comprehension. These stories endure because they contain something deeply human, a warning about the peril of curiosity unbounded by humility. Yet curiosity itself is the engine of progress. It is what drives explorers into unknown lands, scientists into unseen worlds, artists into unimagined forms. The same impulse that lights our discoveries can also ignite our downfall. The Alabama hills of 1871 may have been one of those rare places where this timeless tension between revelation and ruin manifested in tragically human form. For the families of the missing, none of these philosophical speculations mattered. Their suffering was immediate and irreparable. The victims were not symbols or abstractions, they were husbands, sons, and brothers whose absences hollowed entire households. Wives aged into solitude, waiting for men who never returned. Children grew to adulthood without fathers, carrying unspoken grief that shaped their lives. Friends and relatives endured decades of uncertainty, wondering if a different decision, a delayed journey, might have changed fate. One such figure, Margaret Corrigan, the widow of James Corrigan, spent years searching for him before finally leaving for Oregon in 1878. She remarried and tried to rebuild her life, but letters preserved by her descendants show that she never truly released the memory. In a letter dated 1891, 2 decades after his disappearance, she wrote of a recurring dream, James walking among strange rock formations, always visible yet always drifting farther away. She described the dream not with fear, but with melancholy, as a spectral companionship that followed her through life, a reminder that love and loss are sometimes indistinguishable. Other relatives processed their grief in different ways. Some turned toward religion, finding solace in visions of reunion in an afterlife. Others hardened into bitterness, angry at a universe that seemed cruelly indifferent. Still others buried the pain beneath years of silence, pretending to forget, while carrying the ache quietly until death. Sheriff Benjamin Cross, who had led the official investigation, bore the weight of the mystery more visibly. In the years following the disappearances, he developed a private ritual. Once each year, he would visit the Alabama hills alone. He told no one of these pilgrimages, but a nephew who once accompanied him described the experience vividly. Cross moved among the rocks slowly, pausing to touch certain stones as though greeting old acquaintances. His lips moved in silent words. When asked what he was doing, he replied only that he was paying respects to those who were never found. This deeply human undercurrent is easy to overlook beneath layers of speculation about supernatural forces or metaphysical theories. Yet it is the most vital aspect of the story, the sorrow of ordinary people enduring extraordinary loss. Whatever explanations one prefers, rational, spiritual, or something between, the suffering of those left behind remains undeniable. They deserve to be remembered not merely as background figures in a macabre legend, but as real human beings whose lives were irreversibly changed. Esther Wade's tale also compels us to examine how societies respond to those who do not fit the mold. Was she truly the monster her neighbors imagined? Or was she another kind of victim? Someone caught between worlds, manipulated by forces beyond her understanding or control. Was she consciously responsible for the events that followed her presence, or merely the vessel through which they unfolded? Such questions admit no simple resolution. Over time, Esther became less a person and more a symbol, the eternal outsider, the unassimilated other. To some, she represented forbidden female power in an age that feared it. To others, she embodied humanity's fear of the inexplicable, of that which refuses to yield to categorization or mastery. Seen through this symbolic lens, her story continues to echo far beyond the specifics of 19th-century California. And yet symbols are not flesh. Behind the myth was a living woman who ate, slept, and shivered under the desert cold, who perhaps knew loneliness, fear, or longing. To retrieve that humanity through the fog of history and myth may be impossible, but the attempt remains essential. In the decades that followed, as America surged into industrial modernity, the old frontier was tamed. Railroads spanned the continent, cities rose from dust, and the West transformed from wilderness into mapped territory. But not every landscape surrendered to progress. The Alabama hills remained a place apart, one of those rare patches of earth where the past seemed unwilling to die. Even into the 20th century, stories continued. In 1908, a team of geologists conducting surveys in the region recorded unnerving irregularities. Their compasses spun erratically, instruments failed without cause, and early photographic plates emerged clouded and unreadable. In his diary, one scientist described a persistent sensation that he was being watched. Though he saw no other living soul for miles, the group finished their work in haste and left sooner than planned, leaving behind only a few cryptic notes. Official reports from the period offered only vague explanations, citing nothing more than unforeseen technical setbacks. As the 1920s unfolded and automobiles began to fill America's roads, California saw a surge in tourism. Newspapers occasionally published curious stories from travelers passing through the Alabama hills, accounts of sudden disorientation, strange shifts in their sense of time, or lights flickering across the rocks where no known source could explain them. For readers in the cities, these stories served as light-hearted entertainment, tales from the edges of civilization where odd things might still occur. Yet for the people who lived in the region, such accounts stirred unease rather than amusement. They were reminders that something about the area remained unresolved, something that resisted simple explanation. Among locals, a quiet tradition endured, a collection of warnings passed from one generation to the next. Don't pitch a tent in certain places after nightfall. Avoid traveling those trails alone. If the animals refuse to go forward, take heed. These bits of practical caution were rarely written down or spoken about openly, but they persisted as an unbroken oral tradition, respected even when the reasons behind them were forgotten. When World War II arrived, the desert landscapes of California changed once again. The U.S. military set up training sites across the region, some within view of the Alabama hills. Soldiers stationed there often wandered into the rock formations during their free hours, drawn by curiosity. A few later wrote letters home describing the strange sensations they felt, an inexplicable uneasiness that settled over them without warning. One soldier from Ohio told his mother that the place reminded him of battlefields, haunted by memories of violence, though no battles had been fought there to justify such an impression. In the post-war years of the 1950s and 1960s, Hollywood discovered the Alabama hills. The jagged stone landscapes became the perfect natural backdrop for westerns, and production crews flooded in. Temporary camps and film sets appeared among the rocks, where the clatter of cameras replaced the stillness of the desert. Yet during this golden era of filmmaking, something unusual occurred. A noticeably high number of minor mishaps. Cameras malfunctioned for no reason, people developed sudden fevers, props failed unexpectedly, and small injuries occurred more often than statistics would predict. An assistant director who worked on several productions there during the 1960s kept a meticulous personal diary. He noticed that specific locations seemed to cause consistent trouble. In one spot, equipment would repeatedly stop working. In another, actors would complain of sudden nausea or fear. Even the animals brought in for scenes would panic without provocation. Though the man considered himself entirely rational, he gradually began scheduling shoots to avoid these problem areas, accepting their strangeness even if he couldn't explain it. The environmental awareness of the 1970s brought new attention to the region. Alabama Hills was designated as a recreation area, preserving its distinctive geological forms and attracting fresh waves of visitors, climbers, campers, and photographers seeking its cinematic beauty. Few of them knew anything about its darker past. To most, it was simply an idyllic weekend destination. But local guides still noticed certain oddities. Some tourists would cut their trips short, departing abruptly and offering no reason. Others reported vivid, unsettling dreams after a night of camping. A few spoke only of a vague sense that the land itself felt wrong. Around this time, a small circle of dedicated amateur historians began piecing together the region's forgotten history. Motivated by genuine curiosity rather than profit, they combed through archives, interviewed descendants of old settlers, and returned again and again to the hills, documenting what they found. Their collective work finally produced a more complete record of the long, mysterious Esther Wade case, consolidating fragments that had been scattered for decades. One researcher in particular, a woman named Helen Vasquez from Bishop, California, became deeply immersed in the mystery. From 1975 to 1990, she devoted 15 years to gathering testimonies, letters, and official documents. Her unpublished 300-page manuscript, still stored today in the archives of the Inyo County Historical Society, remains one of the most comprehensive accounts of the case. Although Vasquez never reached a firm conclusion, her work reflected a deep respect for the complexity of what she studied. In her closing remarks, she confessed that she began with skepticism, determined to dispel myths and uncover logical answers. But the deeper she went, the less certain she became. She did not claim proof of the supernatural. Rather, she questioned whether the boundaries between the natural and the unexplained were as clear as people liked to think. She suggested that human experience itself might include dimensions that defy conventional understanding. By the 1990s and into the early 2000s, the arrival of the internet transformed the story's afterlife. Esther Wade's name resurfaced across online forums, true crime blogs, and amateur documentary videos. Each retelling added new interpretations, some carefully researched, others purely invented. The story multiplied into countless variations, each emphasizing different aspects of the original events. Ironically, the case became far more famous in the digital age than it ever was in the 19th century. Readers around the world could now browse photographs of the Alabama Hills and even plan trips to the site itself. But this surge in attention came with distortion. Many versions exaggerated or fabricated details to heighten drama, blurring the line between fact and fantasy. Modern visitors often arrive expecting ghosts and hidden portals, armed with infrared cameras or paranormal detectors. Others come searching for the remains of Wade's estate, though nothing of it has survived. A few leave offerings, candles, crystals, or handwritten notes, forming small shrines that local rangers quietly clear away, only for new ones to appear weeks later. In 2015, renewed fascination drew a television crew to the area to film an episode for a show about haunted sites. They camped for 3 nights, capturing footage with specialized equipment. The resulting broadcast was heavily dramatized and offered little substance, but it reached millions of viewers, cementing the Alabama Hills' reputation as a place where mystery lingers. Now, more than a century and a half after the grim events of 1871, the Alabama Hills remain silent sentinels to an enigma that refuses to fade. The wind still carves its way through the valleys, shaping the same rocks that bore witness to everything that came before. Each sunrise bathes them in golden light, each sunset casts long, haunting shadows across the desert floor. The case of Esther Wade has never been solved. 17 documented disappearances remain on record, frozen in time, unlikely ever to be explained. Everyone connected to the story, the victims, investigators, and witnesses, has long since passed, their graves scattered across California and beyond. Their headstones carry no hint of the strange history that once bound them all together. The story endures not through headlines or monuments, but through brittle pages, fading family recollections, and a landscape that has remained virtually untouched by time. The lessons it carries extend far beyond the particulars of the case. It confronts us with a timeless truth, the fragility of human existence when faced with forces that elude comprehension. Those who vanished in 1871 were not adventurers seeking danger. They were ordinary souls, laborers, travelers, settlers, simply hoping for safe passage or honest work in an unfamiliar land. They did not challenge any sinister power. They merely strayed, unknowingly, into a moment where fate turned against them, swallowed by something vast and unyielding. History also exposes the boundaries of human understanding and the limitations of authority. Sheriff Cross, the embodiment of law and structure, pursued the case with unwavering diligence. He followed every lead, recorded each testimony, and adhered to the procedures available to him. Yet, despite his rigor, the machinery of justice failed to grasp what had happened. The law offered no provisions for vanishings without remains, crimes without witnesses, or mysteries without traceable cause. In the end, Cross's steadfast logic proved powerless against a phenomenon that existed beyond the reach of statute or reason. In contrast stood Elias Blackthorne, the scholar who sat across from Esther Wade in her isolated home. His approach was grounded in science, instruments, calculations, and theories drawn from years of academic pursuit. But even he, disciplined and rational, discovered the edges of what could be known. There were points where observation faltered, where the vocabulary of science itself grew thin. His greatest contribution, perhaps, was not discovery but humility, the courage to admit that certain truths lie forever outside human comprehension. And at the center of it all remains Esther Wade, both the heart of the mystery and its most elusive figure. Was she a culprit or a victim? Did she knowingly participate in something unspeakable, or was she merely the vessel through which darker forces moved? Her cryptic words to Blackthorne, about thresholds that cannot be crossed twice, suggest a life burdened by knowledge too terrible to share. Perhaps she, too, bore the weight of her own suffering, isolated by experiences that forever set her apart from ordinary humanity. We live in an era that craves closure, explanation, and neat resolutions. Yet some narratives defy such comforts. They remain open wounds in history, whispering unease instead of delivering clarity. The discomfort they evoke is essential, a reminder that the universe owes us no coherent story. There are truths that remain unspoken, realities that will never fit neatly into our philosophies. Today, the Alabama hills stand in silent beauty, their ridges glowing beneath the desert sun. Thousands arrive each year to climb, photograph, and wander through the labyrinth of rock. Most have never heard the name Esther Wade. To them, the place is a scenic stopover, a tranquil escape from the monotony of asphalt and cities. Perhaps that is as it should be. Life, indifferent and relentless, continues. New laughter echoes where old cries once faded. The earth absorbs everything, memories, bones, and secrets, transforming tragedy into silence carried on the wind. But for those who know, who have read the archives and traced the footprints of the vanished, the terrain feels heavier. Every shadow seems to stretch a little farther. Every pause in the wind feels meaningful. It is not quite fear that grips them, more a quiet reverence, an awareness of standing in a place where the ordinary once brushed against the incomprehensible. The families of the missing never received their answers. Esther Wade herself vanished into obscurity, leaving behind only fragments of rumor and speculation. Scholars and investigators have pursued her truth for generations, only to find themselves circling an ever-deepening mystery. There is no redemption here, no tidy ending where justice prevails. There is only what remains, imperfectly recorded, half understood, and preserved as a solemn warning that not all questions were made to be answered. As the sun dips below the Sierra Nevada, the rocks cast their familiar, elongated shadows. The same desert wind that once carried the voices of 1871 still sweeps across the valleys, stirring dry grass and fragments of forgotten time above. The stars emerge, the same constellations that bore silent witness to those vanished lives. Somewhere beneath that vast sky, on the patch of ground where Esther Wade's modest home once stood, the earth still keeps its counsel. We continue to tell these stories not because we have solved them, but precisely because we have not. They remind us that mystery itself has value, that it humbles us, softens our arrogance, and renews our curiosity. Despite all our progress and invention, we remain explorers in a universe full of unanswered riddles. In that sense, Alabama Hills and Esther Wade have entered the realm of American myth, woven into the larger story of who we are and what we encounter when we step beyond the limits of certainty. The true legacy of this case is not in the missing travelers or in the identity of one woman, but in the question it leaves behind: how should we respond to the truly inexplicable? Some reject it outright, clinging to rigid skepticism. Others embrace every whisper as gospel truth. Wisdom, perhaps, lies somewhere between. in the ability to wonder without surrendering reason. The rocks of the Alabama hills will outlast every generation that questions them. Long after these words fade, after even digital memory corrodes into nothing, they will still stand beneath the endless sky. The earth, patient and eternal, bears witness to our fleeting dramas, absorbs our remains, and moves onward through epochs indifferent to human grief. Within that vast perspective lies both terror and consolation, the recognition that we are transient, yet aware enough to marvel at our own impermanence. And so the story of Esther Wade ends as it began, unresolved. She vanished into the same fog of uncertainty that claimed those before her. We, centuries later, remain searching, asking, wondering. Perhaps the questions themselves are the true inheritance, more precious than any answer could ever be. If you've followed this far into the depths of one of America's strangest and most haunting mysteries, thank you for your time and curiosity. It is through listeners and readers like you that such stories endure, passed from voice to voice, generation to generation. If this investigation has stirred your imagination, I invite you to share your thoughts below or explore more histories that linger in the grey space between the known and the unknown. Thank you for walking beside me through the shadows of the Alabama hills, a place where silence still remembers.